Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Power Cues, the subtle science of leading groups, persuading others, and maximizing your personal impact. By Nick Morgan. Narrated by Stephen Bell Davies.
Introduction. The invisible force that rules human interaction. The Dalai Lama, my father, and my early death. 3 things happened to me when I was 17 that turned out to have a significant effect on my interest in communications, and specifically nonverbal communications later in life. First, I read a book about the Dalai Lama and made him one of my personal heroes. Second, I learned my father was gay. And third, I died. Let me take those in order. I read a book about the Dalai Lama's escape into India from the communists in 1959 and immediately cast him as one of my heroes in a pantheon that included Martin Luther King Jr., President John F. Kennedy, and the Beatles. I was excited, therefore, a half-dozen or so years later, when I had the chance to hear the Dalai Lama speak at the University of Virginia, where I was a graduate student, and cheerfully queued up for a seat in the small auditorium. The room was overflowing with devotees, local Buddhists, and the merely curious. There was an excited, impatient buzz, or at least as impatient as Buddhists get, and the Dalai Lama was late. He was an hour late when he finally took the stage, crossing to the middle of the space slowly, hunched over a little, dressed in his signature saffron robes, much smaller than I'd imagined. I realized I was holding my breath as he crossed the stage. To my astonishment, when he finally reached the center of the space, he sat on the floor, bypassing the comfortable chair that had been provided. He arranged his robes. He looked at us. And then he said nothing. He just looked at us for 1 minute, saying nothing. 2 minutes went by, and he was silent. 3 minutes passed, and still His Holiness said nothing. We were transfixed. Finally, he let out an unearthly laugh, high and spacey like a child's. He said, "I'd better say something really important. I've kept you waiting for so long." After that, his speech was an anticlimax. There was something about the way he looked at us in silence, each person in turn, for those 3 minutes, that made a much deeper impression on everyone in the room than anything he could have said about the science of happiness. Comparing notes afterward with other attendees, I learned that we all shared the feeling that he had touched us in some profound way. I wanted to know, what was it that passed between us? What was it about the Dalai Lama's silent gaze that was so profound? More broadly, how did nonverbal communication work? How could one person transfix me with a look? A look that changed 2 people forever. A look also forever changed my relationship with my father, and it took place in a nanosecond on Christmas Day. I'd rushed around attempting to buy him a present with my usual lack of success. He was a hard man to buy presents for. He didn't have many hobbies and divided his life rigorously between work and home. When he was at home, he did DIY projects or played the piano, but he wasn't the kind of man you'd buy a hammer for. His deep interests were artistic and literary. I couldn't afford to buy him a second piano, so I was looking for a book. I finally found E.M. Forster's posthumously published novel, Maurice. This was the book that revealed his homosexuality, and so had been embargoed until his death. I was dimly aware of this backstory, but it wasn't foremost in my mind. I chose it, I imagined, because of its literary merit. Glad to have the chore accomplished, I thought no more about it. I wrapped up the book and put it under the Christmas tree. On Christmas Day, when my dad got around to opening it, he tore off the wrappings and gave me a very brief, startled look, before regaining his composure, saying thanks, and moving on to the next present. But in that momentary, startled glance, I saw suddenly, intuitively, and finally, that he was gay. It wasn't a question. It was an answer to a question I hadn't realized consciously that I had asked. Nothing was said out loud, and it was 10 more years until my dad came out to me deliberately, but I knew it in that look. That a whole secret life could be revealed in one glance was astonishing to me. Humans didn't need words to tell each other things, even very deeply guarded, private things. How could this be? How could his unconscious mind speak to me that way without him being consciously aware of it? Never toboggan alone. Later that eventful Christmas season, when I was 17, I was tobogganing with a couple of friends on a cold, icy afternoon. The first run went smoothly, so with 17-year-old bravado, I said, "We didn't go fast enough." My friends suggested that perhaps I'd like to try a solo run, so I did. I got a running start, jumped on the toboggan, and crashed headfirst into a tree on the second turn. I fractured my skull and was taken to Geisinger Medical Center in Danville, Pennsylvania. The neurosurgeons there operated on me for a subdural hematoma, a blood clot that was putting pressure on my brain and causing intense pain. I was in a coma for a few days, and at some point during that coma, I died briefly, for a total of about 15 minutes. I came back to life, woke up, and asked the nurse, "Where am I?" Because despite the cliché, it was what I wanted to know first. I think the doctor was relieved, too, because my question meant that I was at least roughly intact, mentally. As it turned out, I was alive, yes, but not everything was normal. Over the next several weeks, I noticed that something odd had happened to my mental processes. The world, or at least the people in it, had become distant and strange for me. I couldn't figure out affect, intent, in other people. Their words seemed hollow. I couldn't tell what they were thinking or feeling. I knew I should be able to tell what was going on with other people, but I couldn't. Everyone around me seemed like automatons, robots, without the affect I was used to before the accident. Something in me had switched off, and I had no idea what. It meant that people were suddenly complete mysteries to me. It was terrifying. So I began to study body language consciously, in a deliberate and indeed panicked attempt to figure out what people were feeling, what their intent was, what they actually meant. I focused obsessively on gesture, facial expressions, posture, the ways people revealed tension in their arms and shoulders, the way they moved closer or further away from each other, their smiles and frowns, everything in short that I could see that might tell me something about what they were feeling. Then, after a couple of months of agonized and largely unsuccessful efforts to read people, efforts that were making me more and more anxious and depressed, something switched on again. The part of my brain that read other people effortlessly, more or less, switched back on as mysteriously as it had switched off. But the whole experience awakened in me a lifelong interest in body language, gesture, and the conscious effort to understand what other people took for granted, happy to pick up emotion and intent, for the most part unconsciously. Over the years, I've continued to study unconscious human behavior, to try to understand how people actually communicate. My work, first in a university setting with public speaking and Shakespeare students, and then with clients over the past 2 decades, has given me a rich set of experiences in the practical implications of focusing on body language in order to make communication more effective and persuasive for leaders and future leaders in politics, education, business, and entertainment. More recently, startling advances in brain science have made it possible to have the beginnings of a rigorously tested and grounded understanding of this essential piece of human behavior. Out of these experiences and from these advances in science, I have developed the 7-step process to communications mastery you'll find in this book. The integrated system is mine. The research that underpins it comes from many scientists from around the world. We're not aware of our most important activities. Most of our communication is indeed unconscious. Our conscious brains can handle something like 40 bits of information a second. That sounds like a lot until you know that our unconscious minds can handle 11 million bits of information per second. So we've evolved to push much of our behavior down to our unconscious minds because they can handle these important chores so much more powerfully and rapidly. Within those constraints, by far the biggest activity the brain undertakes is handling visual input. Visual data can be as much as 10 million bits of information per second out of that 11 million. Yet despite all that computing power and effort, we don't see reality. What we see are the mental images our brains put up in response to the visual input. In essence, the brain gets the visual stimuli, then scans its data banks to find the closest approximate forms that correspond to the visual data. Our minds then offer that stored image as an interpretation of reality. That's what our brains think they see. For example, in a field of view in which most things are still and one thing is moving, the brain doesn't bother to get input on all the still stuff, just the moving item. This kind of triage of visual input has evolved to such an extent because it's essential to our basic survival. It's part of how we're able to act before our conscious minds realize exactly what's happening. For example, if something dangerous is thrown at you and you duck without thinking, getting out of the way a split second before it could hurt you, that's your unconscious mind at work. If you move at virtually the same instant and with the same gesture as someone you love, that's your unconscious mind at work. And if you get a suddenly powerful gut feeling that the person across from you is concealing an important feeling or piece of news, that's your unconscious mind at work. In the first instance, the conscious mind would be too slow to react. In the second and third instances, you'd simply have a much harder time relating well with others. Precisely because all of this mental activity is unconscious, we're not aware of it until it has already started to happen. Studies show, in fact, that we make most decisions unconsciously and only become aware of them consciously afterward, once we already start acting on that decision. The delay can be as long as 9 seconds. In short, for most of the things that matter, your unconscious mind rules you, not the other way around. That should disturb you. The idea chips away at the sense of personal autonomy you have, the sense that you're a sentient being in charge of what you think and how you feel. And what's most important, the sense that you're aware of what's going on with you and around you. In fact, your unconscious mind is in charge. That part of you that you're aware of, that you think of as you, is a chip of ice on top of the tip of the proverbial iceberg that is a human being. But what if you could learn to become aware of the important parts of this unconscious mental activity? What if you could learn to read it in others' minds? And what if you could control conversations, meetings, and all sorts of interactions among the people around you, using that conscious awareness of everyone's unconscious minds, including your own? What if you could walk into a room and effortlessly, or apparently effortlessly, take charge of it? What if you could switch on charisma at will, making all heads swivel in your direction when you walk into that room? What if you could become the natural leader, the go-to person, of most of the groups that you join? What if you could learn the essential power cues that will enable you to master virtually any situation where you want or need to be in control? Would that be worth the effort? Take control of your communications before someone else does. That's what this audiobook is about. I'm going to take you through 7 important nonverbal power cues that will teach you how our communications really work, show you how to take control of your own communications, and help you learn to guide others. Power in human communications and relations is indeed determined largely by the interplay of our unconscious minds. Recent neuroscience has given us, for the first time, a clear understanding of how that unconscious interplay works. We can now identify a series of specific cues that people exchange with one another to determine how they relate to each other. These 7 power cues, if mastered, will allow you to control your own communications and those of the people around you. By the final chapter, you'll know how to literally synchronize others' brainwaves with your own. Along the way, I'll talk through some of the brain science, where it's helpful, and the experiences of my clients, because their stories will illuminate what's possible and what has actually worked in the real world. The 7 power cues. Let's get started. Here's a quick overview of the 7 power cues that will help you signal that you're the leader of the tribe gathered around you. I'll begin each discussion of the individual power cues with a question that highlights the opportunity for strengthening your interpersonal communications. The first power cue is all about self-awareness. How do you show up when you walk into a room? You need to begin to get some sense of how you inhabit space, what your characteristic gestures are, and how you affect others. So you're going to take inventory to find out what you're doing that's effective and what's not. How are you showing up in your conversations, your meetings, and your presentations? In short, what's your persona when you connect with others? Are you powerful and commanding? Are you friendly and warm? Do people fear you, trust you, like you, avoid you, flock to you? What happens? Do you take charge or take a back seat? These are the sort of impressions you need to understand better in order to begin the process of turning into a charismatic version of yourself. The second power cue involves taking charge of your nonverbal communications in order to project the persona you want to project through your emotions. What emotions do you convey through your body language for important moments, conversations, meetings, and presentations? Most of us are not charismatic most of the time because we don't manage and focus our emotions. So we meet other people with 100 things on our minds and a mixed bag of emotions, like our cluttered to-do lists. The result is muddle, not charisma. In step 2, you'll begin the process of learning to manage and focus your emotions when you need to, thus taking charge of your nonverbal communications, your persona, and your charisma to use it at will. Because gesture does in some ways help determine thought, you will also spend some time understanding groups of gestures so that you can monitor how you're doing. In other words, sometimes it does help to fake it until you make it. Or more precisely, You can work from either the inside out, that is, from emotion to gesture, or the outside in, that is, from gesture to emotion. The two approaches complement one another. The third power cue helps you learn to read others' unconscious messages. What unconscious messages are you receiving from others? Because you're already an expert, but at an unconscious level, this step in particular is all about becoming aware of unconscious messages you're already sending yourself, making them conscious in specific ways and at specific times, and then making the new habits routine. Because your skills at reading others involves intent toward you, you'll learn to shape and phrase what you ask of your unconscious mind in that way. It's a matter of learning what specific polarities or pairs of questions to ask your unconscious mind. In this way, you'll begin to be able to recognize and understand what others are thinking before they themselves know it, in many cases. That's because emotional attitudes and decisions are made unconsciously first, then gestured about, then brought to the conscious mind. You'll learn to see the attitude or decision at the gesture stage, and thus before the other person is self-aware. With the fourth power cue, on the mysteries of the human voice, you will turn your voice into a commanding instrument for taking charge of a room. Do you have a leadership voice? The research on the voice is surprising and little known. It will give you an edge over your colleagues and competitors that you will be able to master with some weeks' practice. What's important to note, however, is that individual responses to this step vary considerably. Some find it easy to take control of their voices, others, less musical, find it more difficult. But the results can be powerful and life-changing if you undertake them carefully and thoroughly. Your voice is something you likely take for granted and rarely think about except when you have a cold, but it is one of the primary ways in which you connect with and influence people every day. Controlling your voice is worth the effort. The fifth power cue teaches you how to combine your voice and a host of other social signals to greatly increase your success rate in pitches, meetings, sales situations, and the like. What honest signals do you send out in key work and social situations? Researchers at MIT have discovered that, for example, the success of a venture capital pitch meeting can be predicted with astonishing accuracy by tracking a few aspects of body language. You need to know what those are and learn how to use them to your advantage in high-stress, high-stakes situations. As with the second power cue, either you can learn to control the gestures that signal these messages, or you can control the emotions that control the gestures. As you work your way through the 7 power cues, you'll find that while the idea of taking emotional control of your life may at first appear strange or daunting, in the long run, you'll find it by far the easier, more natural way to project powerful leadership and the communications that go with it. The 6th power cue shows you how to use the power of your unconscious mind to make decisions, rid yourself of phobias and fears, and create a new, more successful persona. Is your unconscious mind holding you back or propelling you forward? You'll apply insights top athletes have used for decades to your personal and work issues in order to redefine your approach to the world as you wish to design it. You'll use these techniques to remove your unconscious storylines that say, "I always go blank under stress," or "I tend to choke when the boss is pressuring me to speak up," or "When I get in front of a crowd, I get nervous and can't seem to do my best." All it takes is a memory of a bad experience to throw you off your world-class game. You'll work at replacing the mental maps that are currently holding you back with winning ones. If it all sounds too New Age to work, take comfort in knowing that the technique was developed by top Soviet researchers during the Cold War in an attempt to dominate the Olympics. And it worked. It garnered the Soviets an extraordinary number of gold medals. The results are real, even if the actions are all in your head. Finally, the seventh power cue helps you put it all together to become a master storyteller who actually synchronizes brain waves with your listeners to enhance your natural leadership capacity, increase your charisma, and move others to action. Are you telling powerful stories? Good storytelling creates a sense of anticipation in the reader's or viewer's mind, and the experience is a pleasurable one for the participants. We humans like that kind of anticipation and confirmation. It's part of our deep-seated desire for communal experiences and tribal connections. Great leaders are great storytellers. These leaders know that they must tell powerful stories to engage and enlist their followers. They know that storytelling is the only effective way to create the kind of transmittal of ideas and values that allows a leader's message to be heard and carried out over time and with many people. They know that the best storytelling taps into deep patterns in the human brain so that the stories fulfill the needs and expectations of the listeners and also create the right sets of messages for the leader's agenda. The last power cue in this process involves becoming one of those master storytellers and learning how to create stories that will convey the essence of your leadership, your mission, and your passion. I will argue that powerful storytelling is the only possible road to the radical authenticity demanded of leaders. In our 24/7, warts and all, YouTubed world, leaders have to be willing to show up with an authenticity that goes well beyond anything demanded of leaders in the past. This audiobook will help you on that road. Take your time. These concepts are easy to master, but mastery of your unconscious communication systems takes time. After all, it took 1,000,000 years of evolution to put all that activity management into your unconscious mind. Most of it should stay there, with good reason. The unconscious mind handles chores like regulating your breathing, heartbeat, and skin temperature, and that's a good thing. You don't want to have to think about all the stuff that keeps you alive and healthy. The aspects of unconscious thinking that I'm describing have to do with your so-called intuition, your reading of others' attitudes, emotions, and intents, and your control of your own body language, broadly defined to include your voice and posture, as well as your mannerisms and gestures. These aspects turn out to be the most important for communication. They do take time to bring to the conscious mind, master, and then send back down to the unconscious mind for retrieval when you need to. These are not simple changes. You're re-engineering a finely tuned, incredibly complex organism with more synapses and connections than there are stars in the Milky Way. If some parts turn out to be more challenging for you, then take it slowly. Make sure that you're comfortable with each power cue before you move on to the next. For the most part, each step builds on the ones before it. So practice each concept for a few weeks until you're comfortable with it, and then move on to the next step. Above all, don't rush the process. You need to get into the habit of listening to your own unconscious mind in ways you most likely haven't before, and that takes time and patience. Let go of your preconceptions. Open up your thinking. It's time to get to know your own mind. Alice got here before you did. Welcome to Wonderland. Most of what we think about the way people communicate is wrong. Yet the reality is much stranger and more astonishing than we can even...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?